two potential trade candidates that the New York Mets and David Stearns could still part ways with before the start of the 2025 regular season. And in this True Mets Talk podcast episode, at the very end, we are getting into a little bit of an early outlook of an opening day roster. Let's get into it. All right, Mets fans, welcome back to the channel. Welcome back to the True Mets Talk podcast. In this episode, clearly we are talking about two names that the Mets could still part ways with via trade or maybe even a buyout. And these are two names that I've talked about at least at some point on this channel this offseason as it pertains to freeing up roster spots and also getting some talent in return. Before we get fully into this video, please do smash those like buttons if you enjoy the content. And if you are new, if you enjoy these discussions surrounding the New York Mets in this offseason, please do subscribe to the channel. And as always, comment your thoughts and opinions on whatever we talk about in this video down in the comment section below. Okay, the first name is a name that we've been talking about for quite some time, a young player still, and potentially needs a change of scenery. And if that doesn't give it away, I don't know what will. Yes, we're talking about Baty. Baty has been an interesting player for the New York Mets over the past couple of seasons and trying to figure out what his actual role for this team moving forward is going to be. Clearly came up in the latter stages of the 2022 season. Didn't really contribute, went down with an injury at the tail end of that season, unfortunately, and had an abysmal time in 2023. We were ready to hit the reset button, especially before the emergence of Mark Vientos in the 2024 season, and he just could not figure it out. What do the Mets do with Baty, who we know teams have been interested in the past to trade for, and we've heard multiple reports from scouts around the league stating that they still believe there is a very good major league player on the horizon in Baty and could use a change of scenery to tap into that potential that we have all seen as he's come up through the minor league system. Now, I know a lot of people like to refer to him as a quadruple A player. We know that he absolutely kills it at the AAA level. Home runs, doubles. I mean, the OPS numbers, the power numbers in general, just skyrocketing in AAA. And then he comes up to the major leagues and absolutely struggles. So what is it with Baty? Is it a confidence thing? Is it a mechanical adjustment that he's not making? Or could it be a combination of both? Now, you see the differentials in the past two seasons for Baty. And it's kind of hard to talk about the compare and contrast between these two seasons when the sample size is nearly a third, in particular with the plate appearances from one year to the next. 108 games in 2023, again, just an absolute struggle-filled season. 9 home runs, a .212 batting average, .275 on base percentage, which is not pretty at all, and an OPS that was sub 600. Just a season to forget about. Fast forward to 2024, 50 games in 2024 for Baty, .229 batting average, 4 home runs only. OBP went up to 306, and the OPS was closer to 650 at 633. So you see some progress there in just the 50 games. But again, when we're talking about the New York Mets, who are very heavy contenders, right, in the NL, when we're talking about World Series outlooks, and I know it's hard to talk about that when the Dodgers are doing what they're doing in this offseason, signing everybody pretty much that's on the market. But nonetheless, the Mets are still going to be in that conversation with them, with the Braves, with the Phillies, and whatever else the NL has to offer this season. And if you're telling me that Pete Alonso isn't going to be on this roster and Mark Vientos is moving over to first base and we have to backfill the third base position internally, well, that already doesn't give me a good feeling to start with, but it sure doesn't give me a good feeling if we're thinking about Baty being that potential fill-in. Now, we have other names that could fit that bill. You have Ronnie Mauricio. We don't know how the knee is going to hold up at the beginning of the season. You also have Luis Angel Acuna, who hasn't played much third base in his career at all, but has the tools to be a successful third baseman and really successful at any position he plays. given his arm strength and range abilities that we've seen so far early on in his career. I mean, he is as sure-handed as it gets. So could the Mets try Luis Angel Acuna at third base if all else fails with Pete Alonso and bringing him back? Now, again, I don't want to get into the teams that could be interested in Brett Baty because I actually posted a short on my channel. If you look at the shorts tab, and it actually kind of popped off. It had like 10K plus views. I'm not really sure why people were gravitating toward that short, but I got some mixed reviews in terms of whether Mets fans actually want to see the Mets part ways with Brett Baty, whether they think his time in Queens is done or not. Because at the end of the day, when we're talking about the sample size of Brett Baty that we've seen so far in his career, it hasn't been much. Injuries have gotten in the way. It's been a thumb, it's been a hamstring, whatever else in between with Brett Baty. But again, in the sample size that we have seen him in a Mets uniform at third base in Queens, it hasn't been pretty. Now, I will say, from the 2023 season to the beginning of the 2024 season, defensively, Brett Baty, to the naked eye, really did get better. The fundamentals, the confidence, the throwing, it all seemed to have gotten a lot better over that offseason for Brett Baty. But we need his bat in this lineup, and it would be so advantageous for him to find a way to succeed at the major league level still in the Mets uniform, given that he is a lefty and that this team needs all the lefty help that they can get. Now, on the flip side of things, I think, and I've been very adamant about this, is that Brett Baty's time in Queens is done. I still think he could be a great ball player. I do think he needs a change of scenery, and I will stick to that statement, particularly surrounding the hitting coaches that the Mets have on this team. I'm not really sure the philosophy and what they're telling Brett Baty and his swing is doing him much justice. And you see this right here and the numbers to the right-hand side of your screen. In particular, right, the ground ball rate. Brett Baty has this infatuation with hitting ground balls. Whether he's actively trying to, I would hope that he's not, or not, the end result has remained the same, that Brett Baty, 50+% of the time in each of the last two seasons, hits the ball on the ground a ton. And that number actually increased by about 4.1% from 2023 to 2024. Again, very hard to talk about these differentials given the lack of sample size, but this is not good. This is not good. And even though he cut the K rate down, the strikeout rate, by just about 3.5%, what good is that going to do you if you're not hitting the ball hard? And the hard hit percentage, if you go on his Baseball Savant page, also remains the same. So you all make the call. Is Brett Baty staying or is he going? Will he be on the major league roster on the bench? Will he be fighting for a starting position in spring training? I do think that if the Mets keep him around, by the time spring training rolls around, he has to have a hell of an offseason or a hell of a spring training, to make this roster, or else he's going right back down to AAA, because the roster spots on this team are as competitive as ever. And again, we've seen the Marlins be sort of interested in Brett Baty. They've shown an unwillingness to trade Sandy Alcantara this offseason. They're going to wait until the trade deadline, presumably. So maybe that's when the Mets save Brett Baty for a potential Alcantara trade. But again, that's not going to be this offseason. The Cardinals could be a fit for Brett Baty. I've mentioned an Arenado swap. You can add in Eric Fetty. You can go ahead and get Ryan Helsley. That's a different route. And also the White Sox could be interested as well. So there are teams that could still use Brett Baty because, again, I do think he's going to be a good major leaguer. It's just not going to come in a Mets uniform. All right, let's talk about the next name that we have here. And this comes off of a previous report, actually, that came out of nowhere this past weekend, and that is Starling Marte. Now, it's always been clear that the best avenue for the Mets is to try to trade, I was going to say get rid of, but that's a little bit harsh, but to try to trade Starling Marte this offseason to get rid of some of that money off the books and also free up a roster spot. And you see this report by Pat Ragazzo coming from this weekend. The Mets are attempting and were attempting to trade Starling Marte this offseason. The club reportedly tried to move him during the winter meetings for Royals relief pitcher Hunter Harvey, who's a flamethrower, had a bad 2024 season, but he was a Washington National. He throws gas. And again, he's a stud. His 2022 and 2023 campaigns were phenomenal. But that trade fell through. The Mets were even willing to pay down some of Marte's salary. So again, everything that we're hearing and everything that I'm feeling from the New York Mets is that this outfield is crowded and they want to free up that roster spot. And we all talk about this platoon DH role that Marte could be a part of now that Jesse Winker is back. And while that's all fine and good, because I'll get into the splits here between lefties and righties for Marte, when I think of a DH, right? First of all, I don't like a platoon DH. I'd like to know who my DH is going to be most of the time, being a singular player, which is why we were so interested in Anthony Santander, who could do it from both sides of the plate. You know he'd be a consistent name. Again, Jesse Winker was trying to find his footing last season in that platoon role with JD Martinez. Does that hinder him? All things to consider here. But when you also go into additional names, like the Mets showing interest in Jurickson Profar, you know, if it's not first base, it's definitely probably going to be in the outfield / DH because he's also a switch hitter. He cannot fit onto this roster if Starling Marte is taking up that spot. Injury-riddled couple of seasons. He hasn't posted 100-plus games since 2022, if I'm not mistaken. That was really his only good year as a New York Met. A good complete year in that 101-win season for the New York Mets. 86 games in 2023. OPS was at 625. The power numbers, 12 combined home runs, 11 or 12 combined home runs in the past two seasons. Yes, the on-base percentage got better from 2023 to 2024, but still not great. He doesn't strike out often. I'll give him that. He does not strike out often, and the walk rate went up from 2023 to 2024. He still only played in 94 games, missed a good chunk of time, I believe, with another lower body injury. I believe it was a hamstring or something of that nature. The only reason you keep Starling Marte around with his defense dwindling, look at his Savant page, the range is not there. And again, all due respect to what he did for the Mets in 2022 is because he knows how to hit left-handed pitching. And if you have Jesse Winker there hitting righties, being a lefty bat, you could, at the end of the day, platoon Marte and Winker if you need to. I still don't think that's the optimal route to take, but by signing Jesse Winker, re-signing him to that one-year deal, I think now that the Mets know not many teams are interested in Starling Marte, if at all, they might be willing to ride into this season and see how it goes up until the trade deadline. You know, here are the splits from 2024 for Marte, right-handers versus left-handers. 251 batting average. It's all self-explanatory right here in red and green. Let's just take a look at the left-handed pitching and what he does. 310 batting average, almost a 400 on-base percentage, an 844 OPS, and 100 at-bats. And you compare that with the numbers to the left off of right-handed hitting, which is, I don't want to say it's respectable, but yeah, it's not really that respectable. 250 with the 659 OPS against righties is not great. He is not going to see much time, if at all, against right-handed pitching. Now, I have no doubt in my mind that he'll probably start this season off at this point now in a Mets uniform come opening day. But again, if it gets to a point where they need to make roster moves laterally and they think that a prospect could contribute right away in the outfield, I don't think that there's going to be any hesitancy to buy out that contract. If they were already willing to pay down his contract in a potential trade with the Royals, as we just saw with that Pat Ragazza report, there should be no hesitancy when it gets to that point when they need to make a decision to buy out his contract. It should be done. If you're keeping him off his feet, if you're keeping him in a platoon role, playing to his strengths, I hope that he turns it around. But being 36 years old, heading towards age 37 in October, doesn't really bode well for the New York Mets and Starling Marte. We'll see what happens. But this is why I'm talking about this video in general, right? most of you are probably like, what's the point? Brett Baty's probably going to be here. You know, we're too late in the offseason to trade him, which I don't think is true, but, you know, stranger things have happened. But I could also see him still being in a Mets uniform as that insurance. And Starling Marte, the same thing, with the lack of other options externally and teams not wanting Starling Marte. And by the way, I could see a plethora of teams taking a chance on him. The Reds, also the Cardinals in a potential trade. The Pirates, if they're willing to deal any of their pitching. But I think the consensus here is that you would need a reliever or a probably back end of the rotation starter in exchange for Starling Marte. The Diamondbacks with Jordan Montgomery would be an ideal scenario to get that sixth starter in the door. I know I've been showing an unwillingness to go down that route before, but again, at this point, kind of desperation mode, I don't know. Maybe you just hold on to Starling Marte at the end of the day, and maybe that's what the Mets do. But this is why it's so important. Let's get to the point here. This is the Mets roster outlook, potential positional roster outlook for the New York Mets heading into spring training and then heading into inevitably that 26-man roster they're going to have to cut down to come opening day. Let's just start here. 26 guys, 13 pitchers comprised of starters and bullpen guys, and then also 13 positional players. And if you see these positional players on your screen right here, it adds up to more than 13. 2 catchers, Alvarez and Torrens. They're basically locks to make this team. Infielders, Lindor, Vientos, McNeil. That's 5 right there. And then you have the young guys, Acuna, Baty, and Mauricio to round that out. That's 8 players on the left-handed side of your screen. And this is where the problem comes with the plethora of outfielders this team now has. Soto, Nimmo, Siri, Winker, Taylor, Marte. That's 6. That's 14 positional players right there. 14. And we're not even talking about bringing back Pete Alonso. That would be 15. We're not even talking about if the Mets are still even interested, remotely interested in bringing back Jose Iglesias. That's 16. I haven't heard anything about Jose Iglesias, but that still could be on the table. So what happens with this overcrowded roster? You're going to need to trade somebody. This is where I'm proposing these 2 names, Brett Baty and Marte, and there's going to be guys that are definitely major leaguers that potentially start their seasons off in AAA, unfortunately. I think Acuna could fall into that category, and I think Ronnie Mauricio, with the injury status, could also fall into that category. So I wanted to just introduce this right here because now we're getting to the point of the offseason. Pitchers and catchers are going to be reporting soon. Spring training is going to ramp up in a month. We need to start talking about the positional player outlook and the roster outlook. And anybody's guess is as good as mine with what happens with Pete Alonso. I did release a video yesterday talking about Alonso and Jurickson Profar. Make sure to check that out. But if they go ahead and bring back one more bat via free agency, they're going to need to clear some room. So Mets fans, let me know what you think about this podcast episode. Let me know what you think about this video, Starling Marte, Brett Baty, and this positional outlook for the New York Mets. Again, trying to engage in some different discussions here on the channel. Hopefully you all enjoyed this video. It's your boy CP. As always, let's go Mets. Until the next video or stream, going live tonight, 5:30 p.m., Mets Hot Stove Live. We'll talk about this and so much more. Let's go Mets. Peace.